The sound of a battering ram against a family's front door. Shouts in the morning sun. For the Hendersons, an elderly black couple, this was the end of their world. They were being evicted from the home they'd owned for 50 years. The police were relentless, their faces grim, their orders absolute. The community watched helpless. But just as the final lock was about to break, a sleek black car pulled up. A woman stepped out, her face a mask of cold fury. She was their daughter. She was a lawyer, and in her hand she held the one thing that could stop it all. The splintering crack of the battering ram against the old oak door was a sound that echoed the breaking of a heart. It was a violent, percussive intrusion into the quiet dawn of a neighborhood that had until that moment felt like a sanctuary. For James and Martha Henderson, huddled together in their living room, the sound was the final, brutal confirmation that their world was being torn apart. The house on Maple Street wasn't just wood and nails. It was a living repository of their lives. It was the place where James had carried Martha over the threshold as a young bride, her laughter bouncing off the newly painted walls. It was where they had raised their daughter Maya, marking her height on the doorframe in the kitchen, a ladder of pencil marks that charted her journey from a wobbly toddler to a confident young woman. The scent of Martha's Sunday pot roast, the faint lingering smell of James's pipe tobacco in the study, the worn patch on the armchair where he'd sat every evening for 50 years. These were the threads that wove the fabric of their existence. And now strangers in uniform were determined to rip it all to shreds. Outside the scene was a chaotic tableau of flashing blue and red lights that painted the serene suburban street in strokes of emergency and alarm. 2 police cruisers were parked haphazardly on the curb, their presence an ugly gash on the manicured lawns. 4 officers, led by a man whose nameplate read Sergeant Miller, were orchestrating the assault on the Hendersons' home. Miller was a man whose physical presence was as imposing as his demeanor was chilling. He was built like a retired linebacker with a thick neck and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl of impatience. He barked orders with a guttural authority, his voice cutting through the morning air like a serrated knife. Again he yelled, and the 2 younger officers, grunting with the effort, swung the battering ram with renewed force. This time, the oak, which had stood firm for generations, finally gave way. The lock shattered, and the door flew inward, crashing against the wall with a deafening bang. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, the officers catching their breath, the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk gasping in collective shock. Inside, Martha let out a small, terrified whimper and clutched James's arm, her knuckles white. James, a man who had faced down his share of life's storms with a quiet, unshakable dignity, now felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear. He was 82 years old, his body frail, his heart weak. He had survived a war, a recession, and a lifetime of subtle and not so subtle racism. But this felt different. This was an invasion, a violation of the one place on earth he had believed to be his fortress. Sergeant Miller and his team stormed into the house, their heavy boots scuffing the polished hardwood floors that Martha had spent countless hours polishing. They moved with a practiced, almost casual brutality, their eyes scanning the room, dismissing the framed family photos, the handcrafted quilts, the shelves of well-loved books, as if they were nothing more than clutter. James Henderson. Miller's voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. James, struggling to his feet, tried to summon the strength to stand tall. "I am James Henderson, and this is my wife Martha. "This is our home." Miller chuckled a dry, humorless sound. "Not anymore, it's not. You've been served an eviction notice. You were given 30 days. The 30 days are up. You are now trespassing on property owned by the bank." "But that's impossible." Martha pleaded, her voice trembling. "We've never missed a payment. Not in 50 years. We own this house. Free and clear." Another officer, a younger man with a nervous energy, stepped forward holding a clipboard. "Ma'am, our records show the property was foreclosed on due to multiple missed payments on a reverse mortgage." James's face, already pale, seemed to drain of all color. "A reverse mortgage? We never took out a reverse mortgage. We wouldn't even know how." Miller waved a dismissive hand. "That's what they all say. Look, I'm not here to debate the paperwork. I'm here to do a job. You can either leave peacefully or we can remove you. It makes no difference to me." He gestured to his officers. "Start moving the furniture to the curb." The two younger officers began to manhandle the Hendersons' belongings. They grabbed the armchair, James's sacred space, and dragged it across the floor, its legs screeching in protest. They started pulling books from the shelves and tossing them into cardboard boxes with a callous disregard for their value. No Martha cried out, rushing forward as one of the officers reached for a delicate porcelain vase that had been her mother's. "Please be careful. That's an heirloom." The officer simply smirked, his fingers wrapping around the vase. "Should have thought about that before you stopped paying your bills, Grandma." The insult, so casual, so cruel, was like a slap in the face. It was the condescending tone, the reduction of her identity to a caricature of a forgetful old woman, that cut the deepest toll. The neighbors watching from their lawns murmured amongst themselves a mixture of outrage and impotence. They had known the Hendersons for decades. They were the bedrock of the community, the kind of neighbors who always had a cup of sugar to spare, a friendly wave from the porch, a kind word for everyone. To see them treated this way in their own home was a desecration. One neighbor, a fiery woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, stepped forward, her arms crossed. "This is wrong, Miller. You know it is. They're good people." Miller turned to her, his eyes cold. "Stay on your side of the street, Maria, or you'll be the one in cuffs. This is official police business." But the seeds of doubt had been planted. James, though terrified, felt a flicker of his old resolve. There had to be a mistake. A terrible, catastrophic mistake. He and Martha had been so careful, so meticulous with their finances. They had worked hard and their whole lives, James as a postman, Martha as a school teacher, to build a life of security, a legacy for their daughter. The idea that they would have squandered it all on a financial product they didn't even understand was ludicrous. "I want to see the paperwork," James said, his voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. "I want to see the court order. I want to see the judge's signature." Miller let out an exasperated sigh, as if dealing with a recalcitrant child. He fumbled in his jacket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers, thrusting them at James. "Here, knock yourself out. It's all legal, all signed and sealed." James's hands trembled as he took the documents. His eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and the dense legal jargon was a forest of impenetrable words. But he could make out the official-looking seals, the imposing letterhead of a law firm he'd never heard of, and at the bottom, a signature. It was all there, a neat, tidy package of legal authority that was systematically dismantling his life. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over him. He looked at Martha, her face a mess of tears and disbelief. He looked at the chaos erupting in their once orderly home. The life they had so carefully built was being dismantled piece by by men who saw them not as human beings, but as an obstacle to be removed. He sank back into his chair, the papers fluttering from his grasp. It was over. They had lost. The system with its labyrinthine rules and its faceless authority had won. Outside the pile of their worldly possessions grew on the lawn, a testament to a life being unceremoniously discarded. The armchair sat at a jaunty, undignified angle. The boxes of books filled with the wisdom of the ages lay next to a box of kitchen utensils. A framed photo of Maya beaming in her cap and gown on her graduation day lay face down in the grass. It was this last image that seemed to break something in Martha. She let out a sob, a raw, guttural sound of pure anguish that seemed to silence the entire street. It was the sound of a mother's heart breaking not just for the loss of her home, but for the desecration of her family's legacy. Sergeant Miller, seemingly impervious to the human misery he was creating, checked his watch. "Let's speed it up," he barked. "I want this property cleared in the next hour." The officers, emboldened by their superiors' callousness, worked with a renewed, almost gleeful efficiency. They were no longer just removing furniture. They were erasing a life. They tossed things with a careless abandon, the sounds of shattering glass and splintering wood adding to the cacophony of the Hendersons' despair. The neighbors watched their faces a mixture of anger and helplessness. They were good people, but they were also law-abiding citizens, and the law in the form of 4 armed men and a piece of paper was on the side of the aggressors. What could they do? To interfere would be to risk arrest, to invite the same kind of brutal, impersonal authority into their own homes. And so they watched. They filmed on their phones their outrage, a sullen digital protest. They murmured their disgust, their words a small, futile act of rebellion. But they did nothing. Because in the face of such overwhelming state-sanctioned power, what could they possibly do? Inside the house, James Henderson, a man who had always believed in the fundamental goodness of people and the fairness of the system, was forced to confront a terrible truth. The world was not always just. Sometimes the good guys didn't win, and sometimes the very people sworn to protect you were the ones holding the battering ram. He closed his eyes, the image of his daughter's smiling face flashing in his mind. Maya, his brilliant, fierce, and loving daughter. He had always been so proud of her, of the woman she had become. A lawyer, no less. A defender of the downtrodden, a champion of justice. A bitter, ironic thought crossed his mind. What good was a lawyer daughter now? She was hundreds of miles away in a different city, living a different life. She didn't even know what was happening. By the time she did, it would be too late. Their home would be gone, their lives uprooted, their dignity shattered. He reached for Martha's hand, his fingers finding hers in the chaos. He held on tight, a silent promise to face this, their final, most devastating storm together. They had nothing left but each other. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Its warmth, a cruel mockery of the coldness that had invaded their home. The pile of their belongings on the lawn grew larger, a monument to their ruin. The end, it seemed, was not just near. It was already here. But the universe, as it often does, had a surprise in store. A twist of fate was already in motion, a counter-narrative hurtling down the highway, fueled by a daughter's love and a lawyer's righteous fury. The sleek black car that turned onto Maple Street was so out of place in the chaotic scene that it seemed to have materialized out of thin air. It moved with a quiet, predatory grace, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing police lights in a distorted, almost mocking way. It parked directly behind Sergeant Miller's cruiser, blocking it in. For a moment, everything stopped. The officers paused, their hands full of the Hendersons' life. The neighbors craned their necks, a new, unexpected current of anticipation rippling through the crowd. Sergeant Miller, his face a mask of annoyance at this new interruption, turned to see who had the audacity to interfere with his work. The driver's side door opened, and a woman emerged. She was tall and slender, dressed in a sharply tailored black suit that spoke of power and success. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face, though beautiful, was set in a mask of such cold, controlled fury that it seemed to lower the temperature on the street. She closed the car door with a soft, definitive click, the sound a punctuation mark at the end of the first act of this tragedy. She surveyed the scene. The police cars, the growing pile of her family's belongings, the shattered front door of her childhood home, the broken look on her parents' faces, and in her eyes a fire ignited a blaze of righteous indignation that was about to consume everything in its path. She took a deep breath, her shoulders squaring her posture, radiating a confidence that was as unshakable as it was intimidating. She began to walk towards Sergeant Miller, her heels clicking on the pavement with a rhythmic, almost military precision. Sergeant Miller watched her approach, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time that day. He was used to dealing with scared, emotional civilians, not with whatever this was. In the living room, Martha's head lifted. Her eyes, clouded with tears, widened in disbelief. She squeezed James's hand. Her voice a hoarse whisper. "James, is that?" James opened his eyes, and for the first time that morning, a flicker of hope, so fragile it was almost painful, ignited in his chest. It was Maya, and she was home. Maya Henderson moved through the chaos of her parents' front lawn like a surgeon entering an operating theater. Her focus was absolute, her expression a study in controlled intensity. She ignored the gawking neighbors and the bewildered police officers, her eyes locked on the man who was clearly in charge, the architect of her family's humiliation. Sergeant Miller, for his part, tried to regain his footing, to reassert the authority that had been so absolute just moments before. He puffed out his chest, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the butt of his service weapon, a classic gesture of intimidation. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," he said, his voice a low growl. "You need to step back." Maya didn't slow her pace. She stopped directly in front of him, so close that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark, furious eyes. She was a good head shorter than him, but she radiated an aura of such indomitable will that he felt for the first time like the one on the defensive. "Are you Sergeant Miller?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel that was more menacing than any shout. He was taken aback by her directness. "I am. And you are?" "I am Maya Henderson," she said, and then she delivered the words that would forever alter the trajectory of that day. "And I am the attorney for the homeowners James and Martha Henderson." The words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. Attorney. The word itself seemed to change the very atmosphere on the street, shifting the balance of power in a way that was both subtle and seismic. The two younger officers, who had been callously tossing the Hendersons' belongings, now stood frozen, their hands full of photo albums and knick-knacks, suddenly acutely aware that their actions were being witnessed by a legal professional. Miller's face, which had been a mask of smug authority, now flickered with a mixture of annoyance and, was that a hint of apprehension? He had been trained to deal with emotional civilians, with angry, powerless people. He had not been trained to deal with a high-powered attorney, who looked at him not with fear, but with a look of cold, analytical contempt. An attorney, he scoffed, trying to recover his composure. "Well, counsellor, you're a little late to the party. The eviction is lawful and proceeding as ordered." "Is it?" Maya's voice was laced with a dangerous skepticism. A lawful eviction requires a valid court order signed by a judge based on a legitimate foreclosure. I have reason to believe that none of those conditions have been met. From her expensive leather briefcase, she produced a slim file. She opened it, her movements precise and economical. "I'd like to see the court order you're acting on, Sergeant." Miller, with a sigh of theatrical impatience, gestured to the young officer with the clipboard. "Show her the paperwork, Johnson." Officer Johnson, a nervous young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, fumbled with the papers before handing them to Maya. Maya took the documents and began to scan them, her eyes moving with a speed and acuity that spoke of years spent dissecting dense legal texts. The silence on the street was now absolute, broken only by the distant chirp of a bird and the hum of the police car radios. Everyone was watching her, waiting for her verdict. Her parents, still in the violated sanctity of their living room, watched her with a mixture of awe and desperate hope. This was their Maya. The little girl they had raised to be strong and independent, now a warrior in a tailored suit fighting for them in a way they could no longer fight for themselves. After a few moments, Maya looked up from the papers, her expression even colder than before. "This is a fascinating piece of paper, Sergeant," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It has all the right-looking stamps, the official-looking letterhead. But it's missing one crucial element." "And what's that?" Councillor Miller asked, his tone mocking. "A judge's signature," Maya said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of a thunderclap. "This isn't a court order. It's a notice of default from a law firm. It has no legal authority to compel an eviction." She held up the paper for him to see, her finger pointing to the blank space where a judge's signature should have been. "You have been enforcing a fraudulent document, Sergeant. You and your men have illegally broken into my parents' home and are in the process of illegally seizing their property. Every action you have taken here today is a violation of my client's constitutional rights." The color drained from Miller's face. He snatched the paper from her hand, his eyes frantically scanning the document, as if hoping a signature would magically appear. But the space remained stubbornly, damningly blank. The younger officers exchanged panicked glances. They were no legal experts, but they knew the difference between a real court order and a piece of paper from a law firm. They had been acting on Miller's authority, on his assurance that everything was by the book. Now it seemed the book was a work of fiction. This is what they gave us." Miller stammered, his bravado finally cracking, revealing the bully's cowardice beneath. The bank's lawyers are not the judicial system." Maya cut him off, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "You are a sworn officer of the law, Sergeant. It is your duty to know the difference. Your failure to do so has exposed you and your entire department to a level of legal and financial liability that will be significant." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then she delivered the next blow. Furthermore, she continued, pulling another document from her file. "I have here a copy of the title to this property. It is in the name of James and Martha Henderson. There is no record of a lien, no record of a reverse mortgage, no record of any foreclosure proceedings filed with the county clerk's office. This house is owned free and clear by my clients." She held up the title, its crisp official paper, a stark contrast to the flimsy, fraudulent document that Miller was still clutching. "The so-called reverse mortgage that you claim my parents defaulted on, it doesn't exist It's a fabrication, a ghost. The crowd of neighbors who had been watching in stunned silence now began to murmur the sound, a low, angry buzz. The narrative had been completely upended. This was no longer a case of a delinquent old couple getting their just desserts. This was a story of a brazen illegal attempt to steal a home from a vulnerable, elderly couple. Mrs. Rodriguez, the fiery neighbor from before, now felt emboldened. "We told you, Miller," she shouted, her voice ringing with vindication. "We told you they were good people. We told you this was wrong." Miller, now cornered and exposed his authority, shattered, turned on her with a snarl. "You stay out of this." But the threat was hollow. His power evaporated. He was no longer the enforcer of the law. He was its violator. Maya, however, was not finished. She was a predator who had her prey cornered, and she was not about to let up. She pulled out her phone, its screen already lit up. "I have already been in contact with my office," she said, her voice a chillingly calm promise of the storm to come. "They are, as we speak, filing for an emergency injunction against you. Sergeant Miller, personally, as well as against the City of New York Police Department. We are also filing a civil suit for damages, including, but not limited to, breaking and entering destruction of property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and elder abuse." She looked at the two younger officers, who now seemed to be trying to shrink into their uniforms. "And you too," she said, her voice softening slightly, but with a clear warning. "Your names will be on that lawsuit as well. Unless, of course, you decide to cooperate fully and provide a statement about who exactly gave you the order to proceed with this illegal eviction based on a fraudulent document." The two officers looked at each other, then at Miller, their expressions a mixture of fear and betrayal. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Was their loyalty to their sergeant worth their careers, their pensions, their futures? Maya then turned her attention back to the growing pile of her parents' belongings on the lawn. Her eyes, which had been so cold and controlled, now filled with a flicker of genuine pain. "And as for this," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you will put everything back, every single book, every photograph, every piece of furniture. You will restore my parents' home to the exact condition it was in before you violated it, and you will do it with the utmost care." She took a step closer to Miller, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that was for his ears only. "And then, Sergeant, you are going to pray. You are going to pray that the damage you have caused today is not irreparable. You are going to pray that my parents, who are elderly and have heart conditions, do not suffer any long-term health consequences from the stress you have inflicted upon them. Because if they do, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your miserable life paying for it in every way the law allows." The threat was not just a legal one. It was a deeply personal vow, a daughter's promise to protect her parents, and it struck Miller with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled back, his face a pasty white, his eyes pure with the dawning realization of the catastrophic miscalculation he had made. He had mistaken vulnerability for weakness, old age for irrelevance, and he had come up against a force of nature he had never anticipated. He looked at Maya, at the unshakable resolve in her eyes, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was utterly, completely, and irrevocably screwed. "Johnson Peterson," he croaked, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable version of its former self. "Put it back. Put it all back. Now." The two younger officers relieved to have a way out. A way to mitigate the damage sprang into action. They began to carry the furniture back into the house, their movements now gentle, almost reverent. They handled the boxes of books as if they were precious artifacts, the porcelain vase as if it were the crown jewels. Maya watched them for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked towards the shattered front door of her home. She stepped over the threshold into the room where her parents were still huddled together, their faces a mixture of shock, relief, and overwhelming pride. Martha was the first to move. She rushed to her daughter, her arms wrapping around her in a fierce, desperate hug. "Maya." She sobbed her tears. Now tears of gratitude, not of despair. "Oh, Maya. You came." "Of course I came." "Mama." Maya whispered her own voice, finally breaking her professional mask, crumbling to reveal the loving, terrified daughter beneath. "Of course I came." James, with the help of his cane, slowly made his way to his daughter. He put a trembling hand on her shoulder, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick with an emotion too profound for words. "My daughter, the lawyer." The three of them stood there for a long moment, a trinity of love and resilience in the midst of the wreckage of their home. Outside, the sounds of the officers working to undo the damage they had done was a testament to the seismic shift that had just occurred. The power had been reclaimed, the narrative rewritten. But Maya knew this was far from over. This wasn't just a case of a rogue cop making a mistake. The fraudulent paperwork, the non-existent reverse mortgage, the targeted harassment of her parents, it was all too clean, too deliberate. This wasn't a random act of bureaucratic incompetence. This was a conspiracy. And as she held her parents close, a new, colder resolve settled over her. She had won the battle, but the war was just beginning, and she would not rest until she had found the person at the heart of this darkness, the person who had tried to destroy her family, and brought them to justice. The karma she vowed would be swift, and it would be brutal. The real fight had just begun. The days that followed the aborted eviction were a strange mix of quiet recovery and simmering tension. On the surface, life on Maple Street began to return to normal. The police cruisers were gone, replaced by the familiar sight of children riding their bikes and neighbors tending to their gardens. The Hendersons' front door, expertly repaired by a carpenter Mrs. Rodriguez had insisted on sending over, showed no sign of the violence it had endured. Inside, every book was back on its shelf, every photograph restored to its rightful place. The officers under Maya's watchful eye had been meticulous in their restoration, their fear a powerful motivator. But beneath the placid surface, a current of unease still flowed. James and Martha, though immensely relieved, were not the same. They moved about their home with a new fragility, as if expecting the fragile peace to be shattered at any moment. A knock on the door would make them jump. The siren of a distant ambulance would send a jolt of anxiety through them. The violation had left a scar, an invisible wound that a new door and neatly arranged furniture could not heal. Maya stayed with them, turning her parents' guest room into a makeshift war room. Her sleek laptop sat incongruously on a floral bedspread, a portal to a world of legal databases, property records, and corporate filings. She had taken an indefinite leave of absence from her high-powered job in Chicago, a decision she had made without a moment's hesitation. Her firm, impressed by the initial reports of her dramatic intervention, had been surprisingly supportive. "Go get 'em, Henderson," her boss had said, a rare note of genuine admiration in his voice. Her initial investigation confirmed what she had suspected. The entire eviction was built on a foundation of lies. She spent hours on the phone with the county clerk's office, her voice a calm, persistent force that brooked no bureaucratic runaround. The clerk, a weary but helpful woman named Dolores, confirmed what Maya already knew. "No, ma'am," she said, her voice tinny over the speakerphone. "There's no record of any reverse mortgage on that property. The title is as clean as a whistle. Has been for 48 years. So where had the fraudulent paperwork come from? The notice of default that Sergeant Miller had so confidently brandished had come from a law firm, Gable and Finch. A quick search revealed them to be a small bottom-feeding outfit, specializing in debt collection and foreclosures with a reputation for aggressive, borderline unethical tactics. They were the kind of firm that preyed on the vulnerable, the elderly, the uninformed. Maya's first call to their office was met with a wall of hostility. The receptionist was rude, the paralegal she was eventually passed to was evasive. They denied everything, claiming they had been acting on information provided by their client. "And who is your client?" Maya asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. "We are not at liberty to disclose that information." The paralegal said, his voice dripping with smug condescension. "You will be—" Maya replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "When you receive my subpoena." But she knew that Gable and Finch were just a tool, a weapon, being wielded by someone else. They were the grunts, not the general. The real question was who had hired them, who had fabricated the story of the reverse mortgage, who stood to gain from her parents being thrown out of their home. The answer, she suspected, lay not in the dusty archives of the county clerk's office, but in the gleaming glass and steel towers of downtown real estate development. The Hendersons' neighborhood, a quiet middle-class enclave, for decades had recently become a hot commodity. It was an island of old-fashioned single-family homes in a sea of gentrification. All around them, luxury condos and trendy boutiques were sprouting up like weeds, driving up property values and pushing out long-time residents. Her suspicions led her to a name that had been cropping up with increasing frequency in the local news Apex Development Group and its charismatic, ruthless CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was the new king of the city's real estate scene. He was handsome, slick, and media-savvy, a master of schmoozing politicians and charming investors. He presented himself as a visionary, a man who was not just building buildings, but revitalizing the urban core. But behind the carefully crafted public image was a reputation for a scorched-earth approach to development. He bought up entire blocks using a combination of charm, cash, and if the rumors were to be believed, coercion to get what he wanted. Maya began to dig into Apex Development. She spent a long, caffeine-fueled night cross-referencing property records, corporate filings, and campaign finance reports. And slowly, a dark and disturbing picture began to emerge. Apex had been systematically buying up properties in her parents' neighborhood for the past 2 years. They had been making offers that were just high enough to be tempting, but still well below the true market value. Many of the Hendersons' older neighbors, living on fixed incomes and unable to keep up with rising property taxes, had sold. But a handful of them, including her parents, had refused. They were the holdouts, the stubborn nails that refused to be hammered down. And then she found the smoking gun. A shell corporation registered to a post office box in Delaware had been quietly buying up the properties that Apex couldn't acquire directly, and the law firm that had handled the transactions for this shell corporation, Gable and Finch. The connection was tenuous, but it was there. It was a thread, and Maya knew that if she pulled on it hard enough, the entire tapestry of deceit would unravel. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in the most unexpected of ways. Her mother, Martha, in an effort to feel useful and to reclaim some sense of normalcy, had started going through old boxes in the attic. Just a bit of spring cleaning, she had said, though it was clear she was searching for something, a tangible piece of her past to hold on to in the face of an uncertain future. She came down the attic stairs holding a dusty old photo album. "Maya, look what I found," she said, her voice wistful. "It's from the old neighborhood block parties." Maya, distracted from her legal research, glanced at the album with a polite but distracted interest. She flipped through the faded photographs of smiling faces of potluck dinners and three-legged races. And then she saw it. A picture from a block party in the early 2000s. In the background, standing next to a younger but still recognizable Mrs. Rodriguez, was a man in a police uniform. He was laughing, a beer in his hand, a part of the community he was supposed to be serving. It was Sergeant Miller. Mom Maya said, her voice sharp with a sudden dawning realization. "Who is this?" Martha peered at the photo. "Oh, that's Michael Miller. He used to live a few streets over. His son played on the same little league team as the Rodriguez boy. He was always a bit of a bully, even back then." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Miller wasn't just a random cop assigned to the eviction. He knew this neighborhood. He knew her parents. He knew exactly who he was terrorizing. This wasn't just a job for him. It was personal. But why? Why would a police sergeant with a long history in the community be a party to such a cruel and illegal act? The answer, Maya suspected, lay in the one place she hadn't yet looked: Miller's own financial records. Getting a subpoena for a police officer's bank records was not easy, but Maya was a very, very good lawyer. She leveraged her lawsuit against the city, arguing that Miller's financial situation was directly relevant to his motive for participating in what was clearly a criminal conspiracy. A sympathetic judge, already alarmed by the details of the illegal eviction, agreed. When the bank records arrived, they told a story of a man living well beyond his means. A new boat, a luxury SUV, 2 expensive family vacations in the last year alone. It was a lifestyle that a police sergeant's salary could not possibly support. And then she found it. A series of large cash deposits made over the past 6 months, totaling over $50,000. The deposits were all made in amounts just under the $10,000 federal reporting limit, a classic money laundering technique. The source of the cash was listed as private security consulting. It was a lie, and Maya knew it. This was a payoff. Miller had been bought. He was the inside man, the muscle for Apex Development's hostile takeover of her parents' neighborhood. He was the one who could be counted on to apply the pressure to bend the rules, to look the other way. He was the one who could turn a fraudulent piece of paper into a battering ram against an old woman's front door. The conspiracy was bigger, darker, and more insidious than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just a greedy developer and a scummy law firm. It was a corrupt police officer, a man sworn to uphold the law, who had sold his soul for a new boat and a trip to the Caribbean. The twist wasn't just that they were being targeted by a faceless corporation. It was that the attack was being facilitated by someone they knew, someone who had once been a part of their community. The betrayal was what made it so monstrous. Maya sat back in her chair, the bank records spread out before her, like a map of human greed and corruption. She looked out the window at the peaceful suburban street at the illusion of safety and order that had been so brutally shattered. She now had all the pieces. She had the fraudulent paperwork from Gable and Finch. She had the connection to Apex Development and their shell corporation. And now she had the proof that Sergeant Miller was on their payroll. It was enough to win her civil suit. It was enough to get Miller fired, to get his badge taken away, to ruin his life. But it wasn't enough for Maya. She didn't just want to win a lawsuit. She wanted to burn their whole corrupt world to the ground. She wanted to see Marcus Thorne, the visionary CEO, in a courtroom, his slick facade stripped away, revealed as the predator he was. She wanted to see the partners at Gable and Finch disbarred. And she wanted to see Sergeant Miller not just lose his job, but trade his police uniform for a prison jumpsuit. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had been holding onto a contact from her days as a prosecutor. The number belonged to an old friend, a man who was now a senior prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, a man who specialized in public corruption cases. "David," she said when he answered. "It's Maya Henderson. We need to talk. I've got a story for you, and you're going to want to hear it." The war had a new front. It was no longer just a civil matter. It was about to become a federal criminal investigation. The karma she had promised was on its way, and it was going to be a firestorm. The meeting with David Chen, a sharp, ambitious prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office, took place in a sterile conference room that smelled of stale coffee and ambition. Maya laid out her case with the precision of a master strategist, presenting her evidence not as a collection of disparate facts, but as an inexorable narrative of greed and corruption. She had the fraudulent documents, the web of shell corporations, the damning bank records. It was a prosecutor's dream, a case gift-wrapped and tied with a bow. David, a man not easily impressed, listened with a growing sense of excitement. This wasn't just another case of a crooked cop. This had tendrils that reached into the highest echelons of the city's real estate world. A successful prosecution of a high-profile target like Marcus Thorne could make a career. "This is comprehensive, Maya," he said, leaning back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You've left us very little to do." "I want them all." "David," Maya said, her voice low and intense. "The lawyers, the cop, and the kingpin. I want to see them in a federal courtroom facing a jury. And you shall have them," he promised. "We'll open a grand jury investigation immediately." The first domino to fall was Sergeant Miller. Two FBI agents in quiet, dark suits that were somehow more intimidating than any police uniform approached him as he was leaving the precinct. They didn't make a scene. They simply showed him the subpoena and the evidence of his cash deposits. They offered him a choice: be the star witness in a federal corruption case, or be the first defendant to be indicted. Miller, his face a mask of sweaty desperation, crumbled. The bully stripped of his badge, and his authority was nothing more than a scared, pathetic man. He sang like a canary, giving the federal investigators every sordid detail of his arrangement with Apex Development. He told them about the meetings with Marcus Thorne's right-hand man, about the cash payments in unmarked envelopes, about the explicit instructions to do whatever it takes to get the holdouts on Maple Street to sell. With Miller's testimony, the grand jury moved swiftly. Indictments came down like a summer rainstorm. The partners at Gable and Finch were indicted on charges of conspiracy and wire fraud. Their smarmy confidence evaporated in the face of federal prosecution, and they too quickly agreed to cooperate in exchange for lesser sentences. But the biggest prize was Marcus Thorne. His arrest was a media sensation. The visionary CEO, The revitalizer of the urban core was led from his gleaming office tower in handcuffs, his slick, handsome face a mixture of shock and outrage. He had believed himself to be untouchable, protected by his wealth and his political connections. He had underestimated the tenacity of a daughter whose family he had tried to destroy. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters with other victims of Thorne's predatory tactics, and with the residents of Maple Street who came to support the Hendersons and to see justice done. Maya was the prosecution's star witness. She took the stand not as a lawyer this time, but as a daughter. She told the story of that terrible morning, of the sound of the battering ram, of the fear in her parents' eyes. She spoke with a quiet, controlled anger that was more powerful than any histrionics. She painted a picture not just of a crime, but of a profound violation of the American dream. The idea that a person's home is their castle, their sanctuary. Her testimony was devastating. The jury was captivated, their faces a mixture of sympathy and outrage. When she was finished, there was a moment of profound silence in the courtroom, broken only by the sound of a juror discreetly wiping away a tear. Thorne's defense was weak and arrogant. His high-priced lawyers tried to paint him as a victim of overzealous prosecutors and disgruntled employees. They tried to portray Maya as a vindictive, publicity-seeking lawyer. But the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony of his co-conspirators damning. The verdict came after only a few hours of deliberation. Guilty. On all counts. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman who had seen her share of corporate greed, was unsparing in her sentencing. Thorne was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, a stunning fall from grace for a man who had once been the king of the city. Gable and Finch were disbarred and received shorter but still significant prison sentences, and as for Sergeant Miller, his cooperation had saved him from a long prison term, but his life was in ruins. He received 5 years of probation, was stripped of his pension, and was forced to sell his boat and his luxury SUV to pay the hefty fines levied against him. He was a pariah in the law enforcement community, a walking, talking, cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. He had traded his honor for a fleeting taste of a life he could never truly afford, and in the end, he had lost everything. The karma was indeed brutal. But the true victory was not in the prison sentences or the financial penalties. It was in the quiet, profound sense of justice that settled over the Hendersons' home. The lawsuit against the city had resulted in a substantial settlement, which Maya, with her parents' blessing, used to set up a foundation to provide free legal services to other victims of predatory real estate practices. The Hendersons' home was no longer just a house. It was a symbol of resistance, a testament to the power of one family to stand up against a corrupt and powerful system. James and Martha, though still bearing the invisible scars of their ordeal, found a new sense of peace. The fear that had haunted them was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding pride in their daughter. They had raised a warrior, a woman who had not only saved their home, but had brought a measure of justice to their entire community. One evening a few months after the trial, Maya was sitting with her parents on their front porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The street was quiet, peaceful. Mrs. Rodriguez waved as she walked her dog. It was a scene of perfect, hard-won tranquility. "You know, James," said, his voice soft for a while there, "I thought we had lost everything. I thought the world was just a cruel, unjust place." And now Maya asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. He looked at his daughter, his eyes shining with love and pride. "Now," he said, "I know that there is still goodness in the world. There is still justice. Sometimes you just have to fight for it. Martha, who had been listening quietly, reached out and took her daughter's hand. You did that, Maya. You fought for it. You brought the karma back to where it belonged. Maya smiled a real, genuine smile of contentment. She had faced down the monsters and won. She had restored her family's honor and protected their legacy. She had found a new purpose for her legal skills, a purpose that was more fulfilling than any corporate bonus or prestigious partnership. She had come home not just to save her parents, but to save a part of herself, the part that still believed in justice, in right and wrong, in the simple, profound idea that a family's love is the most powerful force on earth. The battle was over, the war was won, and on Maple Street, the quiet, peaceful rhythm of life had finally, truly returned. The Hendersons were home, and they were there to stay. The story of the Henderson family is a powerful reminder that justice is not always given. Sometimes it must be taken. It's a story of resilience of a family's love and of the incredible power of one person to stand up against a corrupt system and win. It's a testament to the fact that no matter how dark the night gets, the morning will always come, and sometimes it arrives in a sleek black car armed with a law degree and a righteous fury. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of fighting for what is right, then please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice, karma, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.